Something happened in the airspace over Eastern Europe during the first week of May 2026 that completely shattered everything military academies have taught for the last 50 years about aerial combat and defensive networks. Satellite telemetry and intercepted radio chatter from that morning reveal a 70-minute window that still has intelligence analysts scratching their heads, trying to comprehend the sheer audacity of what unfolded. A formation of unidentified aircraft deliberately crossed into what was universally recognized as the most lethal, heavily fortified airspace on the entire continent, a zone saturated with overlapping layers of multi-million-dollar defense systems that had been locked down tight for months. But instead of executing evasive maneuvers or deploying advanced electronic countermeasures, when the warning receivers inevitably began screaming, the attacking force did the exact opposite of what survival instincts dictate. They flew straight into the teeth of the enemy fire, almost as if they were intentionally feeding their own units into a meat grinder, resulting in a staggering casualty rate that would normally signify a catastrophic failure of command and control. At first glance, this looked like a blind, desperate charge orchestrated by a commander who had completely lost their grip on tactical reality. But as the smoke cleared and the full scope of the operation slowly came into focus, investigators realized they were looking at something entirely unprecedented, forcing them to ask, why would any sane military commander willingly send 18 expensive aircraft on a mission where the vast majority were mathematically guaranteed to die? To even begin unraveling this mystery, we have to look closely at the machines that were creeping across the border in the absolute pitch black of the pre-dawn hours. These were not the cheap, modified commercial quadcopters strapped with mortar shells that the world had grown so accustomed to seeing in grainy frontline footage. The aircraft slipping through the darkness were highly specialized, fixed-wing strike platforms known as FP1 Firepoints, powered by incredibly loud two-cylinder internal combustion engines that echoed through the cold morning air. Each of these machines was a bespoke instrument of destruction, carrying a 220-pound high-explosive warhead designed not for infantry trenches, but for obliterating reinforced concrete and heavy industrial machinery. They were built for sustained, high-speed cruising over vast distances, yet on this specific morning, they were not flying high in the stratosphere where traditional bombers operate. Instead, the entire swarm of 18 aircraft was scraping the earth, flying at a terrifyingly low altitude of just 150 feet above the rolling hillsides and abandoned mining strips. Flying at this altitude in the dark is incredibly dangerous, requiring immense precision just to keep the wings from clipping power lines or tall trees. But this wasn't a reckless stunt performed by thrill-seeking pilots. These machines were entirely unmanned, and their Earth-hugging trajectory was a cold, calculated necessity. Because waiting for them just over the horizon was a piece of technology so advanced and so lethal that simply being seen by it usually meant instant death, raising the question of what exactly the Russian defenders had hidden in the east that warranted this kind of suicidal approach. The system guarding the airspace ahead was the legendary S-400 Triumph, a name that commands immediate respect and fear from any pilot who has ever flown a combat mission. To understand the gravity of the situation, you have to realize that the S-400 is not just a standard anti-aircraft gun that shoots at whatever flies overhead. It is a highly integrated, mobile fortress specifically engineered to detect, track, and annihilate advanced stealth fighters and ballistic missiles hundreds of kilometers away, long before the pilots even know they are being painted by radar. At the heart of this beast is the 91N6E Big Bird radar, a technological marvel that pulses the sky with such immense electromagnetic energy that it can spot an object the size of a tennis ball miles up in the stratosphere. Under normal circumstances, any aircraft approaching an S-400 battery is a doomed aircraft, a blip on a screen that is quickly erased by a hypersonic interceptor. The Russian operators sitting inside their warm, humming command vehicles were highly trained, confident in the absolute superiority of their equipment, and fully expected a quiet watch. But the mission planners who coded the flight paths for the FP1 swarm understood something very fundamental about the nature of advanced radar systems. They knew that no matter how much money is poured into military technology, every machine is ultimately bound by the uncompromising laws of physics, and it was a specific physical vulnerability that the approaching swarm was about to exploit. But the true genius of the attack wasn't just knowing the weakness existed, it was having the absolute ruthlessness required to pull the trigger on a strategy that most commanders would find morally impossible. The physical phenomenon the attackers relied on is known in electronic warfare circles as ground clutter, and it is the Achilles heel of even the most sophisticated radar networks. When a radar system blasts its energy outward to scan the horizon, those invisible waves hit whatever's in their path and bounce back to the receiver, creating the picture the operators see on their screens. If an aircraft is flying high in the empty sky, the signal bounces off the metal hull and returns a clean, unmistakable signature. But when an aircraft flies just 150 feet off the ground, weaving through an industrial landscape, those radar waves don't just hit the aircraft. They slam into the earth. They violently reflect off corrugated metal roofs, they bounce around the steel girders of high-voltage power lines, and they scatter across abandoned vehicles and uneven terrain. All of this chaotic bouncing creates a massive storm of electronic noise, a thick fog of false returns that the radar's computers have to desperately try to filter out. By forcing their drones to fly directly inside this chaotic layer, the attackers were deliberately burying the tiny radar cross-sections of their aircraft within the clutter. When the Russian S-400 battery commander looked at his screen at exactly 0619 hours local time, he did not see 18 clear, locked targets marching toward his position in a neat row. Instead, he saw a messy, confusing display of faint, fractured signal streaks that flickered in and out of existence, resembling system glitches more than a coordinated strike force. A less experienced operator might have dismissed the anomalies as birds or weather interference, but this commander recognized the subtle, terrifying signature of a low-altitude swarm creeping toward his perimeter. He understood exactly what he was looking at, and he knew instantly that if he didn't act within seconds, whatever was out there would be right on top of them, forcing a split-second decision that would set off a chain reaction of violence. The command vehicle erupted into frantic activity as the battery commander barked authorization codes, and moments later, a 4.8 S-6E3 interceptor missile blasted out of its vertical launch tube, tearing a hole in the dawn sky as it accelerated to a blistering Mach 6.5. This was a projectile designed to intercept supersonic fighter jets, and it was closing the 15-mile distance to the fractured signals in a terrifying 9 seconds. But because the drones were swimming in that dense layer of ground clutter, the S-400's targeting computer was struggling to maintain a solid, continuous lock. The missile's onboard seeker was hunting desperately for a clear picture, forcing the Russian crew to rapidly shift radar frequencies and immediately launch a second, and then a third interceptor into the dark just to guarantee a kill against the fleeting shadows. If you are sitting in a bunker controlling 18 highly valuable strike drones and you watch 3 hypersonic missiles rip through the sky directly toward your fleet, standard doctrine dictates an immediate abort. You order evasive maneuvers, you scatter the formation, and you try to save the hardware to fight another day. It is at this exact moment that the operation completely defied military logic. The drones did not dive. They did not scatter. They did not deploy flares or attempt to turn around. They held their course with cold, robotic indifference. One of the leading FP1s maintained its exact trajectory, essentially catching the third Russian interceptor right on the nose, resulting in a blinding, concussive fireball that vaporized the drone and scattered burning composite material across the sky. To the Russian operators, this looked like a successful kill, a validation of their air defense system doing exactly what it was built to do. But what those operators were actually seeing on their monitors was not a victory, but the very first stage of a trap that they had just walked right into. The destruction of that first aircraft was never an accident, nor was it a failure of the drone's evasion programming. It was a deliberate, calculated sacrifice written directly into the mission software. When a 220-pound high-explosive warhead and a fuel-heavy drone collide with a Mach 6.5 interceptor, the resulting explosion doesn't just create shrapnel. It generates an intense, massive sphere of thermal bloom, a blinding flash of heat and electromagnetic interference that temporarily overwhelms and blinds the delicate optical and radar sensors tracking the engagement. In the chaotic, confusing seconds it took for the S-400's processors to filter out the explosive noise, process the debris field, and attempt to reacquire the rest of the swarm, the remaining 17 drones executed a flawless maneuver. They instantly widened their formation, pushed their throttle completely open, and slipped right through the engagement envelope while the radar was essentially rubbing its eyes. The attackers had willingly traded one of their own machines to punch a temporary, 5-second hole in a supposedly impenetrable wall, bringing the swarm 12 miles closer to a target that was still unknown to the defenders. The Russian crew had fired their best weapons, and they had been mathematically outsmarted by a swarm that utilized death as a tactical tool. If you're still watching at this point, you're probably someone who genuinely wants to understand the gritty, complex mechanics of how modern warfare actually operates, rather than just scrolling past sensational, clickbait headlines. That's exactly why I spend hours poring over after-action reports, analyzing satellite imagery, and cross-referencing military doctrine to build these detailed breakdowns. If you feel that this kind of deep, analytical content deserves a place on this platform, taking a second to subscribe genuinely helps the channel keep producing these deep dives. Moving back to the battlefield, the Ukrainian planners knew that slipping past the S-400 was a massive victory, but they also knew it was only the prologue to the nightmare. Because what was waiting for the 17 survivors as they pushed deeper into occupied territory was an entirely different kind of defensive weapon, one that didn't fire a single bullet, yet was infinitely more terrifying. 65 minutes after the radar engagement, the surviving 17 aircraft pushed into the dense Luhansk-Donetsk border belt, maintaining a speed of 120 miles per hour across the undulating hillsides. Suddenly, without any warning sirens or approaching missiles, they slammed into an invisible wall that they had absolutely no way of detecting. At exactly 0511 hours, the lead drone's onboard GPS receiver, a piece of equipment that serves as the absolute lifeblood of autonomous navigation, experienced a catastrophic failure. The receiver dropped from a healthy 12 satellite locks down to 10, then plummeted to 6, and then instantly flatlined at 0. The navigation sky above them hadn't just gotten cloudy. It had been violently, electronically wiped clean by a system known as Pol 21. Unlike the S-400, Pol 21 does not need to see a target on a radar screen, and it does not shoot physical projectiles. Instead, it is an advanced electronic warfare matrix designed to attack the invisible tethers that connect modern drones to the satellites orbiting 12,000 miles above the Earth. These GPS signals are incredibly faint by the time they reach the ground, essentially whispering their coordinates to the receivers. Pol 21 exploits this by utilizing hidden antenna masts distributed across high points in the terrain to project a massive, 60-mile-wide flood of electronic interference, screaming over the L1 and L2 navigation bands with a signal thousands of times stronger than the satellites. The drones were instantly deaf and blind to the outside world, plunging into a complete digital blackout while flying at high speed over hostile terrain. And when a drone loses its GPS in enemy territory, it is forced to rely on a backup system that almost guarantees a slow, terrifying demise. With the GPS signals completely drowned out, the 17 aircraft immediately switched to their internal inertial navigation systems. This is a crude, mechanical method of dead reckoning that relies on internal gyroscopes and accelerometers to measure every twist, turn, and acceleration from a known starting point to estimate where the aircraft is currently located. It works well enough for a few seconds, but the fundamental flaw of inertial navigation is that it accumulates errors incredibly rapidly. At 120 miles per hour, a tiny vibration in the engine block, a sudden gust of crosswind over the hills, or a microscopic misalignment in the gyroscope can cause a 1-degree heading shift. Over a distance of just a few miles, that single degree translates to hundreds of yards of drift. Left unchecked, this drift would pull the entire formation off their planned approach corridor, steering them blindly into a waiting anti-aircraft fire zone, or causing them to completely miss the facility they had already bled to reach. The operators miles away couldn't send commands to fix the drift because the electronic noise was too dense. The swarm was slowly scattering into the hills, losing cohesion, and facing total mission failure. I'm curious what you think about situations like this. If you were the mission commander and you knew your multi-million-dollar swarm was drifting blindly off course into enemy territory, would you consider the mission a failure and try to salvage the hardware? Or would you risk absolutely everything to get back on track? Let me know your thoughts in the comments because I read as many of them as I can to see how different people approach tactical dilemmas. The software driving the swarm had an answer to this dilemma, and it was a solution so brutal that it confirms just how critical the final target actually was. The code recognized the fatal drift and commanded the 2 leading drones to execute a maneuver that sealed their fate. These 2 aircraft broke away from the main formation, slightly raised their altitude, and widened their flight paths, deliberately turning themselves into live probes to map the exact edges of the electronic wall. They were searching for the absolute thinnest layer of jamming, and once they found it, they did the unthinkable. At exactly 0514 hours, the lead drone deliberately broke its radio silence. It opened its transmitters and blasted a tiny data packet into the air for exactly 2 seconds. It was a desperate, screaming request for a satellite fix, a coordinate update, and a formation synchronization command. In an airspace that the Russian electronic warfare operators had worked so painstakingly to keep completely silent, that 2-second transmission shone like a brilliant flare in a pitch-black room. The Pol 21 jamming stations instantly detected the anomaly, triangulated the source of the transmission, and immediately pushed the warning data to a nearby battery of S-350 Vityaz missile systems. The Russian crews reacted with lethal efficiency, and within 8 seconds, a salvo of Mach 3 interceptor missiles ripped out of their tubes, hunting the exact coordinates of that brief transmission. The 2 leading Ukrainian drones knew they were dead the very moment their antennas powered up. They had essentially called in their own execution. One drone banked sharply to the left in a futile evasion attempt, while the other climbed aggressively into the sky, emitting intermittent radar pulses to act as a blazing lighthouse, deliberately drawing every Russian sensor, eye, and missile toward itself and away from the rest of the pack. The interceptors found their marks flawlessly, shredding both decoys in a rain of fire and shattered composite over the empty hillsides. To the Russian operators, they had just successfully hunted down 2 enemy aircraft that dared to use their radios. But once again, they had been played. That 2-second, fatal transmission had successfully punched through the jamming layer just long enough to secure a fresh, pinpoint coordinate fix. It beamed that data back to the remaining 15 drones before the missiles hit. With that updated telemetry, the surviving aircraft instantly recalibrated their drifting inertial systems, pulled their navigation errors back to 0, and seamlessly resynchronized their deadly path toward the objective. They had defeated the electronic blackout using the exact same ruthless math they had applied against the S-400 radar. They had traded metal and circuitry to buy the surviving aircraft one more layer of clearance, proving that they viewed their own machines purely as currency to be spent. But the Russian defenders were not static, and they were beginning to adapt to the rhythm of the attack. As the 15 remaining drones dropped their altitude even further, down to a nerve-wracking 90 feet, to weave through the heavy industrial chimneys and power lines of the Holivka area, they believed they had finally slipped beneath the main field of view of the regional air defense. They had outsmarted the long-range missiles and navigated the jamming zones, but they were completely unaware that a different kind of eye was watching them from the shadows. The industrial airspace suddenly erupted into absolute chaos as the Russians unleashed a localized meat grinder. Buck surface-to-air missiles, fed intercept data directly from the zoo park, tore upward from hidden, short-range emplacements, snatching aircraft out of the sky before they could react. At the same time, highly agile, human-operated Russian FPV interceptor drones dove from above, engaging the heavier, less maneuverable FP1s in terrifying, point-blank dogfights right among the factory smokestacks. It was a brutal, close-quarters brawl. 4 drones were instantly shredded by proximity-fused shrapnel from the Buk missiles. 2 more were physically rammed and destroyed by the FPV hunters. Another fell to localized rapid-fire anti-aircraft guns. The swarm absorbed the horrific punishment, shedding aircraft after aircraft, bleeding metal as they systematically peeled away Russia's overlapping defenses layer by bloody layer. They were being torn apart, but the math of attrition was finally tipping, because as the smoke cleared over the industrial zone, the 6 scarred, battered, but fully armed survivors finally laid eyes on the objective that had cost 12 lives to reach. The target looming ahead was Sever Akmat, and to understand why a commander would sacrifice an entire fleet to reach it, you have to realize